Hey, what's up?
Hey, how we doing?
Doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm good. It's kind of been a busy morning. I was getting doing stuff outside, preparing for the Feast of Tabernacles, and had to come inside real quick and get cleaned up a little bit to do this. And then when we're done here, I'm going back to what I was doing. So
No, understood.
got my adjusting my volume here on the headset so I can hear you. Okay, can you hear me all right? Is this picking up fine?
Oh yeah, everything's fine on my end.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to wait for people to come in, or you just want to have this Actually, hang on. I don't know if this is going to save this or not, so I'm gonna go ahead and do screen recording too in case it doesn't save it. Oh, well, I guess it won't record my mic because I'm using it, but hopefully it's doing that. Let's see. I don't know if that's going to work or not. We'll see if it's going to pick my mic up or not, but hopefully I have my settings right on TikTok. It'll save it for later. Anyway, you want to wait for people, or you just want to just go ahead and have our discussion?
I'm going to share. We've been announcing this for a while,
Okay.
so I'm going to start
I
sharing.
haven't I haven't done a TikTok live in forever, and I'm not high tech on how the lives work, so I'd have to even look to see how to do that.
I've got a question on my end from my live, and I was going to ask you. It's kind of not really important, but is there a denomination or a group that you're a part of that you would associate
There
with?
there is a fellowship that I attend, but if you're looking for what do I call myself, the answer to that is I'm a Hebrew. Is the simplest way to put it. More importantly, more definitively, I believe that Jesus, or I refer to him as his Hebrew name, I believe that Yeshua is my Messiah. That my sins are atoned through him, and because of his sacrifice and providing salvation for us, we should live as he lived and walk as he walked, as we're instructed by the apostles. And so, in that, I follow all of what is called the Mosaic Law that I am able to follow today. There are things that you obviously can't follow today that require there to be a tabernacle or require there to be a Levitical priesthood, things like that. But everything that I am able to follow, I do. And right away, I know people throw contentions and say that well, if you follow one, you have to follow them all, and that they take that from Paul in Galatians. And I disagree with their application of that passage. And I would point to the prophet Daniel in Babylon. He lived under what we call the Old Covenant, but he did not live in Jerusalem. He did not have access to the tabernacle or the temple there. He was not able to do sacrifices or anything else, but he still followed everything that he was able to follow. So in that same like manner, I still follow everything that I'm able to follow and try to do things the way God said to do them. Now, let me clarify. I'm not doing any of that for my salvation. None of that adds to my salvation. None of it is for my salvation. I do it simply because John 14:15, Yeshua said, if you love me, obey my commandments. I love him. I'm going to obey his commandments. And I personally, and I know some people in groups that, I associate with, they say that, that Jesus isn't God. I say that Jesus is God. Now, am I saying I subscribe to the Trinity? I'm not even going to get into into that. That's you know I view the being that we call God. There is a Father. He goes by the name. In the Hebrew, it's the Hebrew Tetragrammaton Yod He Vav He. You can pronounce that. Some people pronounce it Yahweh. Some people pronounce it Jehovah, Yehuah. There's different pronunciations. He is the Father. Yeshua is the Son, and the Spirit, is the Holy Spirit. Those three entities make up what in my opinion, what I, believe to be as God. They are all, in my opinion, one. One's the Father, one's the Son, one's the Spirit. Just like, I am a man, I am a physical body, I have a mind, will, and emotions, and I have an eternal spirit. This physical body will die, but my eternal spirit will go on. I am three in one, as in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are, three in one. So I know that's a lengthy explanation, but that kind of gives an idea of what I believe and where I'm at. So if you're looking for, back to the original question, I attend a fellowship that the name of it's called Torah Family. That's the name of it. There's a guy, he has an online ministry, but he has basically his local ministry started out as a home fellowship that outgrew the home fellowship, and we have, upwards of 300, plus people that, that attend.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
That's the long and skinny of it.
So you're ethnically descended from Jewish people. Like, I don't know how to say it.
Not that I know of. My mom at some point in time had a DNA test done and said, yes, we're, there's Ashkenazi Jew, but no, I wasn't raised Jewish. It's not about being Jewish. There's a difference between being a Hebrew and being a Jew. For when I get
earlier, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I was just clarifying.
Okay, yeah, no, I wasn't raised Jewish or anything like that. It's nothing to do with being Jewish or following Judaism. There's lots of misconceptions about what I do. People think it's Judaism. It's not Judaism. In my opinion, Judaism came after the Babylonian captivity. What Moses taught and what Israel followed prior to their captivities was not the Judaism that we see today. It's vastly different. And even in the Gospels, we see Jesus going against the Pharisees and it's referred to as the traditions of the elders. What we see in the Gospels, the traditions of the elders, is what is, in my opinion, modern day Judaism today. And it's vastly different from what was given to Moses and to all of Israel at Mount Sinai.
Okay. I just want to make clear, like, as I've never done one of those DNA tests. As far as I know, both sides of my family are pretty German descent. My father's family thought they were English until they did some research and found out, we came from Germany. We just changed our name. So I don't think I have very much ethnic-wise. I just consider myself a Gentile. I'm a Christian. So that doesn't really enter into this discussion, but I just...
Right. Okay. I have, as far as that goes, German ancestry, and that's the part that they think is the Ashkenazi Jew part, because the way my maternal grandfather's name was in German, his name indicated like he was of a lineage of priests. So, if he's Ashkenazi Jew, then it might have been, the priestly parts of that. But that's neither here nor there. That's just one of those things in my personal bloodline. It's like, well, maybe I don't know. It doesn't really matter to me. My identity is not in Judah. My identity is in Yeshua the Messiah. And I will say, I'll try to use Jesus where I can, but for 10 plus years now, I've been referring to him as Yeshua, and so that's just what comes naturally to me. But I try to, as Paul said, I became all things to all people. I try to reach people where they're at. So if people don't, if people are coming in and out of the live, when I say Yeshua, if they weren't here at the start, they might not know. So I might say Jesus, Yeshua, both together, just that way people understand exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay. So I'd say we're good to begin whenever you want.
Okay. Let me just give you a little, because I don't know a lot about you. You don't know a lot about me. I believe you, go to Churches of Christ. You identify as a Christian, but I don't know anything about you other than that. And I don't believe you know much about me. So let me start out and give a little bit of introduction, then you can give introduction on who you are and your background. So I talk with my hands too. So normally if I'm doing a live, I'm holding my phone. And so now it's like my hands are free. And so if I'm doing this, I apologize. I am 43 years old, and I got saved in 1987 when I was 5. That would be the first time I'd consider to be saved. Prior to that, my family did not attend church or anything. Then we started attending church, and got saved, got baptized. That's one of my first earliest memories. Is I remember being baptized, and I remember the guy dunking me, and in my little 5-year-old brain, he held me under that water a little too long. Like, was he gonna actually let me back up? I didn't know, but I remember that. I grew up, in the church, and for the most part followed. I mean, when people get, late 18s, early 20s, typically they start, when they're not under their parents' rule and authority, they explore and whatever. And so I had, times in my life where I wasn't, being the best example, of a Christian, but, I've always, come back. I've never, strayed far. I've always been one that I try to, well, I shouldn't say always. Up until I became a father, I just kind of like went with the flow. Like, this is, I just, what the church says is what goes, what they follow. I don't, try to ruffle feathers or whatever, just believed what was, taught from the pulpit. And then in 2009, my wife got pregnant and I became a father. And during that time, there was a series of events of things that were going on. And I don't know if you remember or not, but there was a swine flu epidemic that was going on back in 2009. And there was I don't know what proper word I can use for TikTok, but there was a one of these deals that they were putting out that had not been tested on pregnant women, and a guy that I barely knew at a place where I frequented for my work. By the way, I'm a truck driver. I've been a truck driver since 2005. A guy that worked in a steel mill where I went to on a daily basis came to me one day, and we hardly knew each other. And he says, "Hey, I know your wife's pregnant. Don't let her get that thing because it has not been tested on pregnant women, and you don't know what it could do to your unborn child." And I was like, "Whoa, okay." I never really had thought about that, and so I started doing research, and then researching those sort of things in general. And then somebody else said something else to me about something they'd saw on a documentary. I was like, "What, really?" And so I became what nowadays would be referred to as a truther, somebody who was searching the truth, who wasn't just going to, believe what everything is put out on the mainstream and everything they've been taught. They're going to research it for themselves. And that started in like 2009. And then in 2011, I moved, we're originally from Michigan. 2011, we moved to North Dakota. I was going there to work in the oil field, and God had a totally different plan for me. I went there chasing big oil money. I'm like, I'm going to make a lot of money. Yeah, my family's going to be doing good. And really God's plan for me was he was going to strip me of all of the false theology that I had been taught, through the years, through different churches, and he was going to show me his truth. And that is what I've come to today, that, I believe that our identity in Christ has been stolen from us, that, we think, we're Christians, but in reality, we are Hebrews. The scriptures tell us in Ephesians 2 and Romans 11 that we are grafted into Israel, that we become Israel. And we've been taught, no fault of our own. No one's at fault for being taught a lie and believing it, but you are at fault if you are shown the truth and you continue to, cling on to that lie. But I, started doing research on things and come to realize that, hey, I've been taught all these lies. And, I broke down before my father, not my physical father, my heavenly father, that, I'm sorry that I've lived my life this way and I've been, disobeying your instructions that you gave for me. And that totally turned my life around, totally, changed things in my life. And it was through a long series of events that, only God could have orchestrated. Like, once on the other side of it, it's like looking back, it's like, oh, well, this, the engine blowing up in my car led to my house back in Michigan being lost, in foreclosure, which forced me to not be able to go back to Michigan, which made me then move to North Dakota, because at that time we were living in Alabama, and that caused me to have to go to North Dakota, and then that's when, all these things God started taking out of the way, and that stuff, and it was like one thing after another, and some people would say, oh, what you're doing is not of God, it's demonic. It's like, well, the thing, for me personally, the things that have happened in my life, there's no way that Satan could have orchestrated these events over a course of, 10, 15 years of all different things, seeing the bigger picture, hindsight. There's no way Satan could have orchestrated all of these things to take place, knowing that this would lead to this and this would lead to this and that. So, but anyway, so the Father took away all my false theology I was taught, realized that, hey, we need to be keeping these, laws and commandments that he gave us, who my true identity is. I started, keeping the Sabbath, keeping the feast days, eating clean, wearing tassels on my garments, and trying to, do my best to follow the commandments the best I can. And then, I don't know, 4 or 5 months into that, the Father showed me that we were going to be moving to Northwest Arkansas, and that's where I reside now. We've been here since 2015, so a little over 10 years. There's a huge community of like-minded people like myself here. When we first moved here, there was not. There was maybe 100 people, and my fellowship that I go to, I said there's like 300 plus. That's just one of several fellowships, in our area, in the greater Ozarks area. There's literally thousands upon thousands of us here, and spread all over the country. So that's where I'm at. That's my short little history of who I am, where I came from, and where I'm at today.
Okay. It's weird how some of these stories are similar when I have these conversations with people, because I was raised in a missionary Baptist church. Um, Somewhere between age like 9 or 10, I was baptized, and between 18 and about 22, 23, that's when you sow your wild oats and get away from that sort of stuff. Now, I don't think I was a Christian until 2008. It was February 23rd, I think, when I was baptized, and that's not the discussion. But so about 17 years now, I've been a Christian. I kind of been studying the Bible in order to try to accomplish what you said you've accomplished, like trying to shake loose of some of this theology that I was taught. I don't want to get personal, but I know people in the Baptist church I used to go to, they would never mow their lawn on Sunday, and to them Sunday was the Sabbath, and that's not my position. I don't think the Sabbath was changed to Sunday.
That's correct.
I just don't think it's something that we're obligated to follow, and that can be the discussion. But just personally, um, and I can talk about things I think that are providential in my life that led me to the Church of Christ, as far as a flyer for a Bible study I saw on campus. I'm a friend of a minister there. We were studying the Bible one night, and that's what I didn't know. I couldn't tell you the name of that was on the building that night when I was baptized. It was just someone I knew. We were talking about this issue, and we were getting into it. And then it was probably 2 years before I started studying and started learning, and I just left the Baptist church completely. I talk a bit more about this in detail on my YouTube channel. A lot of things that led me out of that, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here. But I guess I consider myself, a Christian for about 17 years now, and to just kind of mirror what you were saying. But then I kind of want to get into, I guess, really that's our background. But I think the next thing would be your understanding of what we're going to talk about today, which is specifically the Sabbath, and then I want to give a little bit about my understanding, and then we can have the dialogue from there. Unless you have any questions or anything you want to clear up, because I didn't want to spend a lot of time.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no, I don't have a whole lot of questions, or I don't have any questions at the moment. But I've felt like we've never really like been formally introduced, and I think it's important to know somebody's background, to know where they're coming from, and to better be able to relate to them, because like like I said, I'm a truck driver. I'm not a pastor or a preacher. I'm not somebody who's paid by a church or anything like that. I'm just an average guy who who studies his Bible, and try to do the best that I can. Am I perfect? No, far from it. But it's just good to know who each other is, and and where we're coming from, and where we've been, and where we're going. So.
No, don't use the paid preacher stuff against me. Like, I've been on TikTok for about 3 years now, maybe 4. By the time in a couple months, I'll probably be 4. And I haven't really gotten any sort of like monetary thing. I've been filling in preaching for different congregations in the area. Only in the past like 3 months have I started preaching for a small country congregation like the Bidwell Church of Christ. They give me a little bit of gas money to compensate for me preaching and teaching now. But I'm sort of an independent. Like, don't say, I understand people can teach things for money and that sort of thing, but I've been pretty consistent with what I believe for the past 4 years, regardless of whether I'm getting paid or not. So I just want to clear the air for everyone
Do you
watching.
do you have a job outside of preaching?
Oh yeah, see, I should have mentioned that. I currently work for a state university. I'm working for the safety department. Since I have a chemical background or a chemistry degree, I focus on lab safety, which is a lot of training and audits and things of that nature.
Gotcha,
So just
gotcha.
make sure
Yeah, that
everything's
that's a good thing, and like me and it's just a personal thing of mine, but I think people who their sole source of income is just preaching and people pay them, or the donate or whatever because of that. I'm not, big on that. Even in the scriptures, we see that like, the Apostle Paul was a tent maker, and he's,
right.
he still worked. He still had a job. The other apostles had, jobs, as well. So I don't think anybody, and even that, like, we see in Corinthians about them taking up a collection. It never says the collection was for the apostles to do anything. It was to take care of the widows, the orphans, and the poor, and things like that. And so I think that's that having preaching, but then still having a job. I think that's the biblical way to do it, in my opinion. And most of the I'm trying to think. I grew up in like the Assemblies of God churches, and then I started going to some. In my teenage years, we went to like a non-denominational charismatic churches, and I think those ones, the one pastor had a log home building business. The other pastor was a different church, was a pharmacist. So that I think that's a good way to do things. So I give you props on that. And by the way, I give you props on your beard. You have a nice beard. If you had a channel that was not like a preaching teaching channel, I think you should be like the ginger Amish or something like that. Get yourself one of those Amish hats, and that would be a good like spook channel for you. So but okay, so let's get into the Sabbath. Obviously, in telling you about myself and what I believe, the Sabbath is tied in with keeping all of the laws that God gave, and so that's that's the basis of why I believe we should be keeping the Sabbath. Now, it's simple for me to say that, but I need to actually be able to prove that from Scripture. So I did a lot of studying over the weekend to make sure I got everything down. I actually went and watched some Church of Christ pastors talk about the Sabbath, and one of them was Aaron Gallagher. I think he's from GBN, I believe. I'm not sure, but it was just like it was a video from just 2 years ago at like was it Slidewell Church of Christ? I'm not, I forget. Anyway, so what? Yeah. Anyhow,
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't remember.
so I watched his video, and it's like, okay, if I'm gonna be talking about this, I kind of need to know what their side is, where they're coming from on it. And of course, I've got my views, and so I hear him say one thing, and it's like, well, I know that's not correct. Like in his statement, he says, the first time that the Sabbath is mentioned is in Exodus chapter 20. And that's actually not true. So I've got some notes here in front of me, so I'm going to be looking down at my laptop screen. The Sabbath is actually, the word Sabbath actually first shows up in Exodus chapter 16. It's mentioned in Exodus 16, verses 23 through 29, in the reference to the gathering of the manna. Now, this is before the Ten Commandments are given in Exodus chapter 20. But in actuality, we know that the Sabbath, the seventh day of rest, is established in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, where God completed all of creation and then he rested. But then, we move forward. So that's there. That's the day of rest. And that's what the Sabbath is. It's a day of rest. Some people say, oh, it's a day of worship. No, it's a day of rest. It's a day to stop, reset, don't work, don't make anybody else work. Even in the Ten Commandments, it talks about letting your animals rest as well, because they would have had beasts of burden and different animals for plowing fields or working the wine press or the grain mills, things like that. They had animals that was doing that stuff, and they're not supposed to. If you're not working, you're not letting them work either. So you let your animals rest as well. And that goes a step further, when you study more of the laws of God, the seventh year, like when they came into the land, the seventh year was a Sabbath year of rest for the land. You did not plant anything, you did not harvest, you just what grew, you let the land rest. And that's something that we've done, here, on our place. We do a garden every year, and it's grown and grown to the point where we're doing about 5,000 square feet, is the size of our garden. And our 7th year here, we let the land rest. We didn't plant anything. We just, whatever came up, and we'd go, and as things ripen, we take it in and use it. We like to make salsa and stuff like that. But anyway, so that's another aspect of the Sabbath. It's not just, there's several different Sabbaths, but it starts with the day, and then it builds from that. In my study, I was looking in the King James version. I'm not like a King James only or anything. I generally use the New King James a lot, but the software I was using was on the King James. But the Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. In the KJV, 102 words are used to describe how to keep the Sabbath. Only 85 words are used for the next 6 commands combined. So from honor your father and mother to do not covet, there's only 85 words for encompassing all of those 6 commands. But there's 102 words used how to describe the Sabbath. So to me, it's like the Sabbath is very important to God. He gave very clear, detailed instructions on how he wanted this done. And then the first 3 commands actually only has 47 words more than the singular command of the Sabbath. There's 149 words. So thought that was interesting that of the 10 commandments, the one that says to remember, that most of us have been taught to forget about, is the one that God went into the most detail and gave the most instructions about it. And again, it's the only command where God says to remember this. And why is that? Because he knew that people were going to be taught to forget it, in my opinion. See, the Sabbath is next mentioned in Exodus 31. Let me see if I got this still pulled up here. I don't. Well, I'm not going to go through every single example. I was going to had some notes here on what those ones were. But Exodus 31 is next time it's mentioned, verses 12 through 17. In this one, in verses 16 and 17, he says that the Sabbath is a perpetual covenant and a sign between God and the children of Israel. It says, therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. So right there, it says it's to observe the Sabbath to other generations as a perpetual covenant. Now I know, and you might make this argument that word there in the Hebrew is the word olam, and I heard Aaron Gallagher make this claim that the word olam does not always mean forever. It can mean to the end of somebody's life, and he gives the example of the servant who wants to serve their master, doesn't want to leave their house. They'll take him to the doorpost and take it all and drive it through his ear, and the scripture says that servant will serve his master forever. And he makes the point that he's not, serving him till the end of time. I think, in my opinion, that's a false equivalency, because that means that, that actually means that servant is going to serve his master until the end of his life, which is in fact the end of time for that individual. But when God says he's making this covenant as a perpetual covenant, well, that's till the end of time for God, not based on Israel, but based on God. He is the one making the covenant. Also, I would point out, and I did some study on this, on the Hebrew spelling, that word olam is spelled different ways in different times, and it changes the meaning of it. The word olam, where it's used in Exodus 31, the way it's spelled does mean forever, because it's the same spelling that's used in Genesis chapter 9 when God gives the covenant that he will not, to Noah, when he will not flood the earth anymore. It's the same spelling there. It's a different spelling in is it Deuteronomy, I think it is, where the servant's going to have his ear pierced. It's a different it's a different spelling there. And so if one's going to say, oh, the Sabbath is not a perpetual covenant, it doesn't mean forever, then they also, to stay to stay consistent, they would have to say that the covenant made with Noah, where God will not flood the earth with water anymore, is not a perpetual covenant either. They'd have to say that that is not a covenant forever, because they both have the exact same spelling of that Hebrew word. But let me get here to see if I can. Yeah, okay. So I have this. The Hebrew word is olam, but then I decided to look it up in the Greek, okay? Because I know we're going to go into the New Testament later on, so we're getting into Greek. So I'm like, okay, well, what does the Septuagint say on this? The Greek word there used in Exodus 31 is ionios. Ionios is the Greek word there. And that word, if you look that word's meaning up in the Greek, that does mean that it's forever, for eternity, until the end of all time. So one may argue in the Hebrew that that word doesn't mean forever, but in the Greek, that word absolutely does mean forever. So for me right there, it's like, that's a clear indicator that the Sabbath does not end, and it goes until the end of time. And just to point it out, in Exodus 31, that word for olam, if you know the Hebrew letters, it's spelled lamed ayin lamed mem. Let's see. Sorry here. Yeah, this word used in Hebrew is not the same spelling in Exodus 31:17. In 21, it's lamed ayin lamed mem. This is till the end of the life of the servant. Okay, sorry, that's the one where it talks about the one of the servant. In Exodus 31, it's ayin vav lamed mem. So ayin vav lamed mem is the Hebrew spelling of the word olam, that means forever. But the spelling for the word that's just till the end of the end of the servant's life is lamed ayin lamed mem. That right there, even in the Hebrew, would show there's a difference between those two. And again, I mentioned the Septuagint. It uses two different words in the passage talking about the servant. It does not use the same Greek word in Exodus 31 as it does in that passage. It uses a totally different word. So even that in the Greek, it makes a difference between the two of them as well. So in Exodus 31, that word there, forever, actually does definitely mean forever. It's the same word used in Genesis 9, as I said before. Okay, I'm going to just get back to my notes here. Some, may argue that the law of God, which, that the Sabbath is part of it, which is a part, the Sabbath is part of it, was only for Israel. While I know this is false based on Exodus 12:48 through 50, Leviticus 24:22, Numbers 15:15 and 16, and specifically the Sabbath is mentioned to being kept for the sons of the strangers in Isaiah 56:6. And I actually would like to pull that up and read that, and I apologize to do it. I had a Google tab up that had all of my verses on it, and apparently when I shut my computer down last night, it closed that tab, and so now they're all gone. Let's see, that was Isaiah 56:6. If I could spell Isaiah right. I left the second A out of it. There we go. We'll go full chapter here. Okay, so starts out, thus saith the Lord, and so we know that the Father's speaking. Verse 4, thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths and choose what pleases me and hold... Oh, my thing just skipped. For thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths and choose what pleases me and hold fast my covenant, even to them I will give in my house and within my walls a place and a name better than that of the sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Verse 6, also the sons of the foreigner who join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath and holds fast my covenant. Even them I will bring to my holy mountain, and I will make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. So even we see right here, here's a clear example that it's not just for Israel, it's for Gentiles as well. Anybody who chooses to follow God, who follow the God of Israel, the Sabbath is for them as well. Um, let's see. So that's kind of the synopsis of what I went through as far as the Sabbath in the Old Testament. But I know, like for you, it matters what the New Testament says. So let me take a drink real quick, and then we'll move into what we have in the New Testament.
Okay.
Or you want to pause? You got questions on that before we do that?
I don't know how you want to do this, because I'm hearing about 5 different arguments you made from either the number of words or the Hebrew words and stuff, and I don't want to. I'm taking notes. I can keep track and like talk about those. And
Okay.
I think I can't speak for Aaron because you talked about him saying it wasn't until Exodus 20. I would think that maybe what he was saying, or what I would say, is the Sabbath wasn't commanded until Exodus 20. And
Well,
even if there was
okay.
reference to it before that, I think that might be his position, and that would be one way I might feel comfortable wording it.
Okay, and I can play off of that. So, that might be what he meant, but he specific if I remember correctly, he specifically said it's not mentioned until Exodus 20, and I was like, well, that's incorrect. But let's just say that it's not commanded.
Yeah,
That is
I'm
what's
okay
that?
with I'm okay with tabling that because like I'm okay with understanding you. This There was some understanding of the Sabbath prior to like from creation or from Exodus. The word Sabbath there, he might argue, is just like the seventh day of the week, or like that's what the word would mean. But the actual observance of the Sabbath wouldn't be given until 20. So if we can just work off that framework where it's not commanded until Sinai.
Right. So, and that's where I would say that would be considered, in my opinion, it's an argument from silence, and here's why.
Right.
There is no command for the eating or the distinguishing of clean and unclean animals until Leviticus chapter 11. But in Genesis chapter 7, it says that Noah took 7 pairs of clean animals on the ark and only 1 pair of unclean animals. So we see that Noah, at that time, knew the difference between clean and unclean animals. Also, we do not have any commands as far as how to do sacrifices until also, at Mount Sinai. But we know that Abraham did sacrifices, and we know that Cain and Abel were doing sacrifices. So I would make the argument that there were times where God spoke to man to, I'd say, at the start with Adam, and gave him instructions on how to do things, and those instructions were not recorded, or if they were recorded, written down, those records have been lost, to us. But that they probably weren't necessarily written down, but they were orally handed down. Like God told Adam, "Hey, you have to do sacrifices now. Here's how you got to do them." Adam taught them to his sons. And then we have the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain getting the sacrifices wrong, not giving his best as what God would wanted. And so we see that there are things that men were doing, men who were trying to follow God, they were doing these things, but we don't have any record of them being commanded. So we can reason that yes, there was a command to do these things. We just don't have the record of those commands.
And yeah, I'm good with just tabling that because I don't want to spend too much time going back and forth on that.
Okay.
However, I do. There's an argument to be made that did Noah have an understanding of clean versus unclean, or did God reveal to him like these are clean, these are unclean, when He tells him to separate them, or is Moses using clean and unclean to describe the type of animals Noah had, as far as like the way the children of Israel would understand as they're reading the Torah? So it's a bit of a prolepsis. It's like, they went to this mountain. It was called Mount. I can't remember which way it goes. There's one mountain called this, but it's actually called that later on. So Moses can speak of things where names are changed or things come into play that they would understand. It's a bit of a prolepsis. It's like if I say I met my wife in college, and I didn't, but she wasn't my wife when I met her, but she's my wife.
Right.
So there's an argument to be made for that clean and unclean in reference to Noah being a prolepsis. If you're familiar with that phrase or that.
I am not. I am not. It sounds like something where something's that's supposed to be inside comes outside. So.
Oh, yeah. Right. It's just calling something by a name that would be understood later, but was not referred to that name then.
Gotcha.
So.
I can see that. But to me, in the whole of Scripture, it makes more sense that from the time of Adam, when sacrifices would have started, they would have had to have known what animals were clean and what animals were unclean, so they can know what animals were for sacrifices and what animals weren't for sacrifices. It's a consistency that has to flow, through Scripture.
I mean, we don't know much about what's revealed in the patriarchal age, and I would say even Job's sacrifice. I think Job's prior to the law of Moses as well.
Right.
So, again, like I said, as far as whether it's commanded until Sinai, that's going to be it's really
right. Not necessarily command, but to use the Church of Christ, Seni commands, examples, and necessary inferences. We don't have the command, but we have an example, and we have multiple examples, so we can make a necessary inference from that, hey, we have the example of them doing this, so we can infer that there was a command to do this, even though we don't have the direct command recorded.
I think you need to take a second look at what Seni means. Like, we have an example, like Paul preaching to midnight. Like, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to preach to midnight.
Right. No, but
but you don't have an approved example without a command typically, and we can get into that when it comes to that's going to come into play when it comes to Acts 20, if we get to that point. But
okay.
I just want to give you a little bit of pushback on your argument for the number of words in the Sabbath command in Exodus 20, because if you're arguing that they already practiced the Sabbath, then why would so many words be needed for God to tell them, okay, this is how you keep the Sabbath?
Because it had been forgotten. Because they were in Egypt for however so many years. They had lost their ways. They're having to basically relearn this, and also it's there for future generations to understand. Hey, this is important. And I have a good close friend that this was the key that unlocked it for him, that, hey, we need to be following all these things. He was just, normal average Joe, Christian, and he's going through reading the Ten Commandments. He's like, wait a second, he's the one pointing this out to me. He's like, look how much, time and effort and words God puts into talking about the Sabbath. Like, this really shows, this is important to him. He wanted to get his point across. Maybe we should be considering this. And he's his journey started out with just keeping the Sabbath. He was still, he had pigs, he had rabbits, he was eating pork, he was eating all that stuff and going to church on Sunday and all that kind of stuff. But he's like, you know what? God says the Sabbath's important. I'm going to do that. So, I would just say that some men had been keeping it before, but Israel had lost their way. They had lost the instructions that God had given. So he had to give it to them again, basically. But it's important to him, it literally at the dawn of creation, it started. So it is important to him, because he himself, did God actually need to rest? Was God exhausted after 6 days of making all of creation? Was he exhausted? Did he actually need to rest? No, in my opinion, no, he didn't. But he said, you know what? My creation's going to need to rest. So I'm going to rest. I'm going to show them the example. I'm going to rest. And I'm going to institute a rest for them 1 day a week, the 7th day of the week. At the end of the week, they're going to rest. And as long as they follow, his commands anyway, they will. They'll rest. They'll be refreshed and good to go. Did he need it? No, he didn't need it, but he gave it to us. And as Jesus, said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man, for the Sabbath.
Right. So again, whether the Sabbath was commanded before Exodus 20 or whether it wasn't, I think both are kind of alluding to silence, and I don't want to get bogged down in assumptions one way or the other.
Okay.
We again, it's a point of disagreement. I just think we need to move on because a lot of the rest of what you were saying has to do with the meaning of Hebrew and Greek words, and and then whether the law is only for Israel, which is going to be a big sticking point. I think we need to address before we move on.
Okay.
So the definition of a word is not defined by the spelling. The reason like a word like olam would take different spelling forms and or any Greek word would take different forms is because uh, it depends on like the verb. It's usually not like this when it comes to like gender or number or things like that. Like with a noun, or I guess forever is an adverb, isn't it? So it's a little bit.
I'll be honest. The adjectives, the adverbs, all that kind of stuff, I get confused on that. I have to every time I'm doing something, I have to go and look that up because I can't remember. I have to look them up every time. So,
Well, it will be a covenant. I think it's describing the being. It's going to be a covenant, in a lasting sense. Whether that's like you said, the end of someone's life, or whether it's a forever thing. And I think this is where I kind of had my opening as far as what you hold to. Like, I understand the Sabbath is said to be forever, and I understand the reading of it. And you would also keep the dietary restrictions as well, under the clean and unclean, like personally.
yeah.
Okay. Because I actually couldn't find anything about it being like forever, but I understand your argument. Now, the New Testament regarding circumcision doesn't really avail anything. What's your understanding of circumcision in light of Hebrews wrote?
Genesis chapter, and we're going off my notes. So here I'm going off the top of my head. Genesis chapter 17. The physical circumcision is given to Abraham for anyone who is inside of his household, whether they are native born or whether they are bought with a price, meaning he buys them, they become his servants. It's for everyone inside of Abraham's household. And so I know the contention you're making, and I think Paul talks about it in Galatians. I would argue that the entire book of Galatians needs to be read in the context of Acts 15, verse 1, and understand that if you are getting circumcised to earn your salvation, like is preached in Acts 15:1, where it says, men from Judea came down teaching the brethren that unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. They were teaching that Jesus doesn't bring salvation, circumcision does. So if somebody is getting circumcised to earn their salvation, that circumcision avails them nothing. It means absolutely nothing to them, and Christ died for nothing because they're not trusting in Christ for their salvation, but trusting in circumcision. And then in that same chapter, the Pharisees jump on the bandwagon and believe these people, and then they say, oh, they also have to keep the law of Moses. And again, this is in the context of for salvation. So does somebody need to get circumcised to get saved? In my opinion, based on the scriptures, no.
Okay, we agree.
Does somebody who has a circumcised heart? Okay, so circumcision of the heart is not a New Testament thing like people are commonly taught. It is a very much an Old Testament thing. It's mentioned 4 or 5 times at least, and if I needed to, I could go pull up the scriptures for you if you need to see them. But it says, there's several times.
I agree.
Oh, you agree?
Rend your heart and not your garments is what's repeated in the prophets. So it's essentially.
There's one where it says references you stiff-necked people circumcise the foreskins of your hearts, and there's other references to that. I would make the point that the circumcision in the flesh does you no good if you're not circumcised in the heart as well. And how many wicked kings did Israel have that say they had the father was a righteous king, right? So he would have followed God's laws, which means that when he had a son, he would have circumcised him on the 8th day. But then for some reason, that son would be, when he becomes king, is a wicked king, does not follow God's instructions. So he's circumcised in the flesh, but he's not circumcised in the heart. So that does you no good. But I would say then that one who is circumcised in the heart, when they read the scriptures, would then be led to be circumcised in the flesh, because they would see that it is a command from God. It's a part of being in the covenant with Him. And this might make people upset. According to the scriptures, in order to take part in the Passover, you had to be circumcised.
Gotcha.
And so I would say that if you are wanting to take part in Jesus's Passover sacrifice, for us, you would need to be certain. Now, am I saying that's tied into your salvation? No, I'm not saying that. But if the Father says, if you read the scriptures and the Father puts it on your heart, hey, you need to be circumcised, I think you should follow the Father's leading. And if you're not, that's between you and the Father. I'm not gonna. Technically, by definition, that would be a sin at that point. If you have the understanding that that's something that's supposed to be done and you don't do it, it is a sin, whether, if you choose not to obey. I will say I'm very thankful that coming into this, that I was circumcised as a baby, because if I wasn't and I had to do that, that might have been a serious area of contention for me. But I will say this too. I know people who came into this walk who believe the way I believe, that we're not circumcised, and as adults and teenagers and stuff got circumcised. So it's crazy to think that, but there are people that are like, you know what? The Father said to do this. I'm going to do this. I love Him. I'm going to obey His commandments. But it does nothing for your salvation.
Okay, so I kind of appreciate your consistency. Genesis 17 does speak of circumcision as an everlasting covenant. It is given to Abraham before the law. Obviously, only males should be circumcised. There's no such thing as
female circumcision. And the thing
for the chat, I just want to make that clear for the chat before someone gets misunderstanding.
I don't know how this works. Am I only seeing the chat from my side? Because I have my end shows 0 guests, and I just see where people have liked. I see no comments at all on mine.
Oh, you're seeing your side. I'm seeing like a handful of comments. We've got viewers. We've got about 8 people coming and going.
Okay, I got you.
So now, as far as Galatians goes, Titus was not circumcised when Paul brought him before the Jerusalem elders with the Pharisees.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, he wasn't circumcised. At that time he wasn't circumcised, and I would say to that, that's fine. He was not convinced yet that he needed to be. Do we know that he was later on? We don't know. But I'm not gonna. I'm again, like I said, it doesn't add to your salvation. It's just an act of obedience, and he wasn't to that point yet.
Like I said, I see a consistency. I do appreciate it. Some people will argue for the Sabbath, and then they'll say, well, circumcision is no longer, and they'll interpret Paul kind of similar to the way I would, and they would say, there's no need to be circumcised, it doesn't matter. They'll say, well, there's and we're not going to get into the passages about dietary restrictions like rice, kill, and eat, because that's going to bog us down. That's not the discussion. Now, as far as the Levitical priesthood, though, because it also is called a lasting ordinance, an everlasting covenant. Deuteronomy 18:5 says they will stand and minister always. And Exodus 29:9 is one of the verses I reference, like a lasting ordinance. Numbers 18:19, the Levitical priesthood is going to be an everlasting covenant of salt, and there will be someone to stand and minister always. So again, we have this term that sometimes means always and forever, and sometimes it means from multiple generations. It goes back to Olam and Ionios and all that. So, do you understand the priesthood to have had an end in the new covenant?
So your statement is then that the new covenant brought an end to the Levitical priesthood.
We could just get bogged down in Hebrews here if we wanted to. Like, for Jesus to be high priest of the tribe of Judah, there would have to be a change of law. And so,
but he can't be a high priest on earth because he's not from the line of Levi, so he could never be a high priest on earth. That's why he's a high priest in heaven in the order of Melchizedek.
I don't want to get eschatology into this, but do you view a future millennium as Jesus being on earth?
Yes. I believe Acts chapter 1 and Zechariah 14 and Isaiah 66 all speak of this. And there's other passages as well, but I know Satan bound for 1,000 years. I think that's in Revelation, is it 20?
Yeah.
But there's others. Speaking of the law in general and everything, in Matthew 5, Jesus said that, do not think that I've come to, destroy the law and prophets. I did not come to fulfill. But then he goes on to say, surely until heaven and earth pass away, not a single letter will pass from the law, or not a single jot or tittle, which we understand it's the biggest letter and littlest letter in the Hebrew, will pass from the law until all is fulfilled. Well, he says this about the law and the prophets, not just the law, but the law and the prophets. And people lots of times forget that. He said, do not think I came to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. Well, there are prophecies that have not been fulfilled yet. Zechariah 14 is a great example of this. Zechariah 14 talks about the Lord coming to earth, setting his foot down on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives being split in two, and a great valley being in it, and the remnant flees through that valley. Then it goes on to say that those who came up against Jerusalem year by year will be required to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And if they don't, they will not receive rain on their land. These are events that have not taken place yet, but I believe they're going to. In Acts chapter 1, when Jesus ascends and, the apostles are looking up into the clouds and they can't see him anymore, two angels appear to them, and they tell him what? They say, why are you, looking for him? He's not here. But he will return in the same way that he left. So he ascended from the Mount of Olives, physically ascended from the Mount of Olives, and in my belief and understanding, Zechariah 14 prophesies his physical descent back down to the Mount of Olives.
Okay. So
I think that so I'm gonna put this all on the table. With again, we can get bogged down in eschatology, but it's right. End time stuff is I've loved end time stuff since I was a teenager, and I've studied a lot of it. Matter of fact, I was one of those people that was reading the Left Behind books, and I was like, and back then I believed in a pre-tribulation rapture. That's what I was taught by my church, and that was one of the first things when God started stripping away false theology. The pre-tribulation rapture was the first thing that had to go. He started leading me down these paths. And that was the first thing that he took out was the pre-tribulation rapture. But I read those Left Behind books, which I know they're fiction, but they're based on, they have scriptures in them, and they're showing their opinion of how this path walks through the scriptures. It made me want to miss the rapture. All through my teenage years and early and mid-20s, I was like, I wanted to miss the rapture because it's I want to be here. That's going to be the best time on earth ever, is because souls are being brought into the kingdom left and right, literally snatching souls out of the devil's hands. I want to be here for that, and then come to find out, hey, in my belief, there is no pre-tribulation rapture, and so we are going to be here for the tribulation. Those times, will be happening. So all that stuff for me is future events that are going to be taking place. So I believe the new covenant has not started yet. I'm gonna put that out there. I believe the new covenant has not started yet, based on what we read in Jeremiah 31 and in Hebrews chapter 8. I believe it is a future event, and I believe it's going to take place after Jesus returns, after he wipes out the Antichrist army, and he gathers all of his people. I believe that is when the new covenant will be started, and it will institute, the millennial kingdom where he'll reign for 1,000 years, and then we have the prophecies of Isaiah 2 and Micah. Is it Micah 2 or Micah 4? Those will be fulfilled at that time. Zechariah 14 will be fulfilled. What the heck's going on here? Zechariah 14. Hang on, I got this.
Puzzle piece.
Just popped it. The puzzle piece, yeah.
Slide it. It's making sure that you're active, that you're not showing a video.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I had to do that earlier. Just take your time.
Okay.
The spot.
Yep, I got it. I actually have comments on my thing now. I was looking at those too. So I believe that the new covenant institution is a future event that we're looking forward to. And that's, that institution, the new covenant, is what's going to kick off the 1,000-year reign, and then we're going to see these other prophecies that will be fulfilled. And so then there's, Isaiah 66 talks about that he'll choose new Levites from among the nations. Well, if all the sacrifices and everything are done away with, what do we need Levite priests for? And also, when did that, if it's not a future event, when did that take place when Levites were chosen from among the Gentiles? In my opinion, it has not happened yet. It's a future event, because if people are going to be keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, like it talks about in Zechariah 14, well, if you read through Leviticus 23, and then where it talks about them again in Deuteronomy about the Feast of Tabernacles, it's an 8-day event, which it's coming up. It starts next week for us. The 5th of October? Yeah, 5th of October it starts. Looking forward to it. It's my one vacation a year. I love it. But anyway, in that keeping of that feast, there's daily offerings of animals that are made. And there's 100 some odd animals in that 8-day period that are offered, to the Father. So you'll need Levitical priests to make that happen in the way God said it's supposed to happen.
See, I was raised in a pre-trib rapture space with the Baptist Church, so the very notion that Christ is going to be reigning on earth in Jerusalem in the millennium and animal sacrifices are going on, I find to be extremely offensive, to Christ, not to me.
Understand.
I don't want to
understand this. Right, but understand this. People lots of times think that sacrifices are only for sin. Sacrifices are not only for sin. There are sacrifices for things other than sin. So you can have sacrifices going on and it not be diminishing what Jesus did. And to that note, in Acts 21, Paul takes the Nazirite vow and he goes to the temple to complete that vow. That involves animal sacrifices. So we have an example right there from Paul that Jesus didn't bring an end to all sacrifices like it was commonly taught today.
So, as far as the actual destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman armies, do you think that has anything to do with any New Testament passage or import or their rejection of Jesus as Messiah?
No, because people say, oh, the Jews rejected Jesus. And I would disagree with that because all of the apostles were Jews. They did not reject Jesus.
Well, that's kind of a touching point. But
I would say this, the destruction of the temple and all of that has no bearing whatsoever on the institution of a new covenant or anything of that nature, in the same way that the destruction of the temple the first time did not bring an end to the old covenant then. So there was a covenant with Israel before there was ever a tabernacle, before there was ever a temple. There was a covenant at Sinai before they had any of those things. Do you need that to keep certain aspects of it? Yes, but those things being gone and done away with does not bring an end to it. It to a point, even during the time of Jesus, they did not have the Ark of the Covenant. They did not have the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies at that time. It was hidden away by the prophet Jeremiah. And I had to go look it up where it is in the book of Jeremiah. But it talks about that. The prophet Jeremiah took it and hid it away in a cave. So they were still going through the motions, essentially, without having all of the elements there that God required. But I think those things are, going to be coming back, again at some point. But they were still doing what they could, even though they didn't have all the elements there.
Do you believe there's going to be a rebuilt temple before the millennium comes?
Yes, I think so. That's where it's like, I don't know exactly how that plays, but in Matthew 24, Jesus talks about when you see the abomination of desolation that Daniel talked about, flee. And again, this is a good point about the Sabbath as well. He says there in Matthew 24, pray that your flight is not in winter or on the Sabbath day. If Jesus at his death or his ascension or his resurrection, however where you want to play it out, if he instituted a new covenant that did away with the Sabbath, then why would he be telling people in Matthew 24 to not to pray that their flight is not on the Sabbath day if it was going to be done away with just 4 or 5 chapters later. There was no abomination of desolation between the time when Jesus said that in Matthew 24 and Matthew 28 and Acts 1.
Well, again, I don't want to get bogged down in this. I happened to preach from Matthew 24 this morning, given the recent false rapture prediction and all that. So
Right.
I really do think that the first 34 verses are speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem within one generation. Based on
They very well could be, and I don't have any issue with that. But at the same time, what we see with other prophecies can be fulfilled multiple times over. They can be cyclical. So yes, that could have happened there, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen again another time.
All right, that's fair. Again, that's why it's so hard to have these discussions, because there's double prophecy, there's back and forth about symbolic, literal, figurative language, which, see, when I see the Old Testament talking about Gentiles keeping the Sabbath, like the Isaiah 56 passage you brought up, when I see the Gentiles coming and grabbing, and looking forward to incense and sacrifices and all that, I think there's a spiritual significance in the church for both Jew and Gentile that can only be communicated by using, like, the shadows, the incense, the prayers, the Sabbath, the rest, which ultimately the rest is heaven, but that's probably what we might have to get into. I don't know if we're going to be able to get into the New Testament, to be honest, in the time we have so far. So I see a lot of things like Hebrews 10:1 talks about how all these things of the, maybe not the specific Levitical priesthood, but of Israel, of the ordinances and things, like these are the shadow, but it's not exactly the reality. And again, we disagree about the new covenant and the nature of what we call the church or whatever, but I see a lot of things foretold that aren't necessarily those exact things are going to be around or be in place. It's just a shadow of the spiritual reality that we have in, again, I'm trying not to get bogged down in the eschatology.
So,
really cares a lot
right,
about.
so the shadow, but the substance is of Christ, right? That's the passage you're referring to.
Right.
Okay, so let's think about that. I wish I could turn the lights off and I had another light here. Maybe I could do this. Okay, so we can see right here. Here's the shadow. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, yeah. Here's the shadow. See the shadow of my hand, right? You can see my fingers, right? Right. So here's the shadow of my hand, but here is my actual hand. Well, the shadow, yes, it looks like my hand, but it's not my hand. But the shadow leads to my hand, but it still looks like it. Yes, it's slightly distorted because of the angle of the light or whatever. I mean, I could take a light and position it just right where the shadow looks the same size as my hand and everything else. I would say this: the shadows still look like the actual thing. So to say that the shadow just completely goes away, the substance is in Christ, meaning these are the shadows, these are the things that point us to Christ, but Christ himself, I mean, he kept the Sabbath, and he talked so much about, and we have this thing we have to understand it in the first century time too. At this point, the Pharisees, they had their oral traditions, and their traditions of the elders and everything else, where they had added so much to God's law because they were so bad at keeping it. They made all these other rules and regulations and everything else. And that's what we see Jesus chastising them for adding to God's law. And in Matthew, Matthew 15 and Mark 7, when they have when the disciples are eating bread with unwashed hands, right? And they say, why do your disciples forsake the traditions of the elders? And Jesus basically rips them a new one, and he says to them, why do you forsake the commandments of God for your traditions? And he tells them, that they're in vain worship, basically. And he talks about Isaiah. Isaiah prophesied well of you hypocrites, and he talks about them being, they clean the bowls and the pitchers and everything else, but they're still filthy. I'm butchering that passage, and I apologize, but
No, that's all right.
the point is, Jesus makes a distinction between God's way of doing things and the Jews' way of doing things, and Jesus is bringing a restoration of the right way to do things. They had added so many rules and laws concerning the Sabbath that it literally became a burden to try to keep the Sabbath. Even when Jesus heals the man and he tells him to pick up his mat and go to the temple, right? And what do the Pharisees say? Who told you could do that? Because even to them, picking up that mat was work in their book. That's not work in God's book. That would not be considered work to carry your mat off. Now, you get into some of the prophets, it talks about not carrying a load like through the city gates or whatever on the Sabbath. That's different. And you think about, like your a bed mat versus like a load. Like that, you're talking about like your labor intensive. You've got something, heavy. Like, let's think of it like the difference between like a military rucksack versus just a sleeping bag. That's that we're talking. There's a big difference here. I could put a sleeping bag on my back and probably walk for hours upon hours on end and probably not break a sweat. But if I put like an 80-90 pound military rucksack on my back, guess what? Chubby boy like me, within 20-30 minutes, I'm gonna be dripping with sweat. I'm laboring, at that point. So the shadow, part of this too is trying to understand the first century time and all of these things that they've come up with. Like, those can also be considered part of the shadows, but the substance is of Christ. Like, hey, they've said, let's do all this stuff. And that's, again, this is the part of the distorted picture of the shadow is distorted in a certain way. They have distorted the keeping of the Sabbath by all the things they've added to it. And they're saying, no. He's saying, no, look to Yeshua. Look to Jesus. The substance of how to keep this is found in him. He came to show us the right way to keep these things because man had taken it and distorted it.
Okay, I think we can put a pin in the Old Testament conversation. But my main thing is the Levitical priesthood is called to be an everlasting covenant and ordinance. It exists until the time of the first century. Jerusalem's destroyed, the temple's destroyed. There's no Levitical priesthood for 2,000 years. Christ is in heaven according to the order of Melchizedek. I don't believe there's anyone today that can trace their lineage to Levi as a result of that destruction. And
I agree with you on that. I know there are Jews today that say that they can, but I disagree with that. And to make this point, because I know some people have been asked this, I watched another Sabbath debate and I saw a gentleman ask a Sabbath keeper this very question. If there was a temple built in Jerusalem today and there was Levitical priests, would you go and sacrifice? Me personally, no, because I do not believe that the people that they are going to have there are actually going to be actual legit Levitical priests. And I don't want that to sound like I'm being anti-Semitic, but here's why. I base this on Isaiah 66, that Jesus will choose the Levites from among the nations. Why? Because they've lost their identity. They don't know who they are. There's people that are claiming today that they are, but we don't know. But I know for a fact that Jesus knows who the actual lineage of Aaron is, and he knows where they are in the nations. And when he returns and he gathers his people there, he will take them. He'll be like, you and you and you. You are the ones. You are the ones I chose. You are the Levites. You are the line of Aaron. And that will... Well, sorry, there's Levites in the line of Aaron, which Aaron's a Levite, yes, but the priesthood, there's a difference between the priests that serve in there and then the rest of the Levites, the things they do. He will choose them because who says they are today is not necessarily who they are.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with your view as far as in the millennium, God can sort that out. Like, I don't have a problem with that. I have a fundamental more problem with eschatology, but we're not going to spend time on that. But...
We'll be here till midnight. Somebody might fall out of a window.
True. So if Christianity has existed without a Levitical priesthood, um, I don't see how it's difficult to understand how it could exist without those dietary restrictions and without circumcision being.
You
I understand you said not necessary for salvation, but
you don't need the priesthood for those things.
I understand that.
Abraham had circumcision without any Levitical priests. They're the clean and unclean animals. Any average Joe can figure those things out of what animals are considered clean in God's eyes and what animals are considered unclean. So those things that you mentioned don't have any bearing on whether there's a priesthood in place or not.
Okay, do you want to touch on some New Testament passages?
Yeah,
Um,
I've got lots of stuff here on the New Testament.
I've got, I think, about like 9 verses. I really want to like. I can go through this quickly. Like, all I have in my notes is like a 5-10 minute opening statement. Like, not in a debate, but
Okay.
I can walk through my view pretty quickly. But I kind of want to give you a quick summary, if that's fine.
Right. Okay. I'll just go through. I'll go through some of these pretty quick. In Matthew 28, 1 through 8, Jesus distinguishes between God's way of keeping the Sabbath and the man-made Jewish laws. I kind of went over this already.
That's fine.
And in that passage, he definitely says that the Sabbath is a day. It's a singular day, because some people make the argument that every day is the Sabbath in Jesus. No, it's an actual singular day. It's the seventh day of the week. I brought up Matthew 24 already. Some will say that the Sabbath was abolished at the cross, or his ascension, resurrection, whatever. But Matthew 24, that verse we mentioned, that pray your flights not on the Sabbath, which shows that according to what Jesus believed, that there's going to come a day when people are still keeping the Sabbath and they're going to have to flee Jerusalem, and so the Sabbath would still be in place then. Mark 2:27, Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He didn't say it was made for the Jews or for Israel, but for all of mankind. And this rings true back to the writings of Solomon, Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. He says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. And God will bring into judgment everything, whether good or evil, and whether it's public or private, basically. So it's, again, that's God's laws for all of mankind, not just for Jews, not just for Israel. God desires everybody to follow him and obey his instructions, and that would include the Sabbath. Let's see. In Mark 2:28, it's the same as Matthew 28, Jesus declares that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. In a sense, he's declaring himself to be the God who gave the Sabbath. I know that for people who don't think that Jesus is God, that would throw some red flags for them right there. Also, to the point of and examples, all through the Gospels, it records that Jesus was going into the synagogues and teaching on the Sabbath day. And we also see the very same thing with Paul as well. He went to the place where people were gathering on the Sabbath to hear the words of Moses read. And again, we're shown this to be true as well in Matthew 23, 1 through 3, when he tells the multitude and his disciples that when the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, do what they say, but don't do as they do, because they don't follow the own things that they read from the seat of Moses. And this lines up with Acts 15:21, where after the discussion they had about whether people should be circumcised to be saved or not, they say all the new believers, these are the 4 things they need to do. Abstain from sexual immorality, from things polluted by idols, from things strangled, and from blood. And then it goes on to say in verse 21, for Moses has had from times past those who are reading his words in the synagogue every Sabbath. That's where people went to hear the writings of Moses read. It was done on the Sabbath. Jesus was going to the synagogue on the Sabbath, participating in that. And that, to that point too, okay, and this is something where in modern times we don't think about this. I've got a Bible on my laptop. I've got a Bible on my phone. I've got physical Bibles. Everybody's got Bibles. There's Bibles in hotel rooms and everything else. Back then it was not like that. They had scrolls that had these things, and they were kept at the synagogues. You had to go there to hear them hear them read. So it wasn't like what we have today. We think, oh, everybody has access to the scriptures. It wasn't like that back then. So if, like the story of Jesus when he goes in and he reads from Isaiah and he says this has been fulfilled and you're declaring himself to be the Messiah, he had to go there where the scrolls were in order to declare it. So even like when we see later on with Paul, he goes into the synagogues. Why? Because that's where the scrolls are there. That's when they can go and pull these open and he can say, look, Jesus did this, this, and this. Here is the prophecies from the prophets where he fulfilled these things to prove he's the Messiah. They went where the word was, and that word was read, on the Sabbath day. Let's see. What's that?
I was just correct.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said that. My bad. When I'm talking and then you talk, you're kind of muffled at first until your microphone kind of picks up more. So I just want to make sure I didn't miss what you said there. Let's see. I covered the one about the Pharisees eating, or them accusing him of breaking the Sabbath of eating bread with unwashed hands. Carry the mat away. I covered that one already. Covered that about the scrolls. Let's see. Acts 17, 2-4, Paul goes to the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths. And just as I stated, he did this to preach Christ from the scriptures to them. In verses 10-14, Paul goes to Berea, where they again went to the synagogue. And here they searched the scriptures daily to see if what Paul spoke was truth. This verse right here shows that what Paul preached had to line up with what we have in the Old Testament. Because the only scriptures that they would have had at that time would have been what we now call the Old Testament today. So, and this is where, I differ from the majority of Christianity. Though most of Christianity will say Paul spoke against the law. Well, that can't be true if the Bereans found what Paul said to be true, and the Bereans were going through the Old Testament scriptures to see if what Paul spoke was truth. Because if Paul is speaking against the law of God, then the law of God is all through the scriptures and the prophets. The two, he can't be speaking against it and then say what Paul spoke is the truth. It doesn't work. He has to be speaking the truth, and it has to line up with the Old Testament. Otherwise, what that statement is made in Acts 17 about the Bereans would be a false statement then. Let's see. Acts 18, 1-11, Paul goes to Corinth. Verse 4 says, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, persuading both Jews and Greeks. It goes on to say that some of the Jews opposed him, and he shook his garments off and left. But then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed, and then God tells Paul to not be afraid, and he was there for 18 months teaching them. And it's, based on the previous verses, you assume that he's teaching them, on the Sabbath. Now, here's the thing. Is he only limited to teaching on the Sabbath? No, he can go out and teach any day, every day, out in town square, wherever, whoever should listen. But on the Sabbath day, that's when people gather in the synagogues, and that's where the scrolls are kept, and that's when he can take them through the scripture. Because it's not just take my word for it. What does the scripture say? And he can show them from the scriptures these things, to be true. How Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. He is the Messiah, and he is the way, and these are how things are to be done. And also, in the same chapter in Acts 18, this goes along with the keeping of the law, which is really, that's the all-encompassing umbrella of this entire conversation, because if you're going to keep the Sabbath, next thing is that you definitely know we should be keeping the whole law. In verse 21 of Acts 18, Paul says he must depart from Ephesus to keep the upcoming feast. So we have an example right here of Paul still keeping the feast long after Jesus has ascended. Let's see. This leads us to the last mention of the Sabbath in the Bible, which is Colossians 2:16, which is commonly in my opinion, is commonly misinterpreted as to not let anyone judge you for not keeping the Sabbath and feast days, which then makes Paul out to be a hypocrite. 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. As we went through everything in the Gospels, Christ kept the feast. And we saw in Acts 18, Paul's also keeping the feast, so he can't tell people to not keep the feast without making himself out to hold to a double standard and being double-minded. And I would say that I'm not saying Paul is a hypocrite. I'm not saying Paul is double-minded and holding to a double standard. I'm saying people have been misinterpreting Paul for 2 millennia now. That Paul kept the feast, Yeshua kept the feast. Paul tells us to imitate him as he imitates Christ. We see Paul, keeping the feast there. We see Paul keeping the Sabbath. That is the example that we are supposed to be following. Um, and even in 2 Peter 3:16, we see that even in that time, still in the first century, Peter warns about Paul's writings that they're difficult to understand, and the untaught and unlearned will twist them and being led away into the error of the wicked. Well, do the wicked follow the law of God? No, that's the error they're into. They don't follow God's instructions, and that's what people even at that time were twisting Paul's writings. And Paul was accused of that. Paul was accused of teaching people not to follow the law of God. And again, as I mentioned before, in Acts 21, he takes the Nazarite vow to prove to people, no, he's not teaching against the law of God. These are false statements that people were making, trying to falsely accuse him and trying to imprison him to stop him. And I think that part of that comes from people like from the circumcision party that's mentioned in Acts 15, and then it's again mentioned in the book of Galatians, which again is why I said the entire book of Galatians needs to be read in the context of Acts 15:1, that there were men teaching a false salvation by circumcision. And so a lot of what Paul said is misunderstood. And the thing is, it's not your fault, Jim. It's not anybody else's fault that they were taught a lie and they didn't know they were taught a lie and then they believed a lie. But it is our responsibility that when we are shown the truth to decide, okay, am I going to follow, am I going to get rid of what like I've been presented new information that contradicts what I was previously told. Can I verify this new information is correct or not? I would say I think I've made a pretty good case to show that, hey, Paul was doing all these things we should be doing as Paul did. Jesus was doing all these things we should be doing as Jesus did. Can we? And I had to do this myself, because like I said, I was raised in the church. Can we admit that, hey, we were taught a lie, and we need to change our behavior to be more like our Messiah?
Okay, so I already addressed Matthew 24, and just at this point of agreement, I've never met anyone of any denomination who understands those four things in Acts 15 as being something that is binding on Christians. So we do take that seriously, whether it's part of the old law or not. I was trained by a minister named Gene West, and he was over in England, and he was offered blood pudding, and he said, "Oh, there's no way I can have that. It's against my religion." "What religion are you?" "I'm a Christian." And she's like confused, and I remember him saying like to eat that would be just as bad as like committing fornication, and she's like, "Oh, it cannot be that bad at all, can it?" I always remember that story because, like, yeah, to avoid blood and things offered to idols and fornication and those sort of things. I mean, everyone takes fornication seriously. Some people don't take the blood restriction seriously. So
Or the
I would,
or the strangling, for that matter.
that's the other one. Sorry. I met someone who's like a kind of messianic, or I don't know exactly what the phrase would be. But I remember they're always impressed when I say that, that we understand that this is something that the elders of Jerusalem said, and we should avoid it. Now, if you order your steak rare, that's not the same thing. That's not blood.
No,
People,
no,
people get mixed about
correct.
that sort of thing.
Yep.
So I was really
Hemoglobin versus myoglobin. There's a difference.
now the main point, and a lot of people don't know about these passages in Acts. How Paul went to the Sabbath, or the synagogue here on the Sabbath, and the synagogue there on the Sabbath. And just what we're going to disagree about is why he went there. Like, if the worshippers of Odin were meeting on Wednesday, Woden's then I think Paul would go, maybe talk to them, maybe outside, maybe not so much inside, I don't think that he's doing this as an observance. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because I understand the apostles were Jewish, they were raised Jewish, for lack of a better term, or Israelite. And, like, it doesn't bother me that Paul does these things because he's Jewish. I think, Titus not being circumcised, the Gentiles not being called to, you're saying they shouldn't be circumcised or follow the law of Moses for salvation. I'm saying they're under no compunction to follow the law of Moses at all. But I understand why Paul would do this and be at the feast. And if I were Jewish myself, I would, consider it a possibility. Imagine if I could keep these things and do these things and be able to go speak to Jewish people about the Messiah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Those four commands in Acts 15, you said that those all come from the law of Moses, right?
Uh, actually,
I
uh,
I can show you
actually,
where
I
they
think
do
both.
if
Well, I know they are in the law, but I think there's some. I think they're spoken of to Noah and Abraham before the law, even. No, that doesn't mean that everything before the law is still binding. Because
not
don't
not the
interpret me
not
wrong.
the drinking of blood or the strangling, those are not spoken to either one of them.
Again, that's just something I read in the commentary. We could speak more about that in greater detail.
Well,
Uh,
the point I would make is if you believe that people should follow those four commands, you are believing that people should follow the law of Moses because those did come from. It wasn't like it was four laws that they just made up. It was four laws from the law of Moses that they were supposed to start following right away.
well, let me clarify, because this is where the debates kind of go. It's like between Church of Christ and on the Sabbath. It's like I saw one debate. It was just a bunch of yelling, like, "You keep 9 out of the 10 commandments. You keep 9 out of the 10 commandments." It's like we don't keep the 10 commandments because they're part of the law. We keep 9 out of the 10 commandments because they're repeated in the New Testament, and because the majority of them are moral principles, even if they
Can,
weren't repeated necessarily.
can, can I ask a question?
So, yeah, absolutely.
Um, where does it say that in order for a command to have to be followed, it has to be repeated in the New Testament? And follow up to that, if a command is in the Old Testament but not in the New, does that mean that we don't have to follow that, or it's okay to um, break that command necessarily?
Okay, that's a really good question, and that's why I wanted to lead with this statement, because the purpose of the law of Moses, I think, is given in the New Testament. Romans 15:4 says it's for our learning. Not Genesis. Galatians 3 says it was the schoolmaster to bring us to Christ until Christ should come. That's why I see a lot of shadow versus reality. Like I brought up that already, but that was another point. So I believe we have an old law, we have a new law. It's called the law of Christ, the law of the Spirit. And there are some differences. So, and just while I have the floor, because this is really my main point, well, two more things. One is the Colossians 2 passage you brought up. When it comes to diet and festivals, new moons and Sabbath, let no one judge you. Does that go both ways, or does it just don't let someone judge you for doing it? Is where we're going to disagree. Romans 14 talks about esteeming one day above another. And you'll say, well, that doesn't apply to the Sabbath. Some will esteem one day above another will esteem every day alike. Let each be convinced in their own mind. I think that's fairly cut and dry. I understand. I mean, we can talk about it in more detail.
I
Galatians 4, go
what,
ahead.
what was that passage in Colossians? Well, I'm taking a note so I can. It's Colossians 2, right?
Yeah, Colossians 2 was the one you mentioned about the diet, festival, new moon, Sabbath. Let no one judge you.
No, the one you just mentioned about the keeping of a day.
Romans 14:5 and 6. And I think it might be repeated elsewhere, but Romans 14:5 and 6
Oh
is
yeah, Romans 14. That's correct. Okay, Romans 14.
matters of opinion. I can pretty much quote it because every time there's a holiday that comes up and it's like Christians need to celebrate Christmas and Christians shouldn't celebrate Christmas, I'm like, this is the standard. Just do your own personal thing and leave it alone. Don't start telling people they can. Don't start telling people they can't. And that's kind of where I see issues like this falling under the Romans 14:15 caveat. Well, not caveat, category. Sorry. But if I could give, if you're, yeah, maybe
I'm
just
good.
write
Yeah,
this down.
yeah. I'm keep taking notes. Go ahead.
Galatians 4:9 through 11, it speaks about these weak and beggarly elements, like I said, kind of the shadowy things, but just in context, observing days, months, seasons, and years. those do seem to be like weak and back. And you're saying not for salvation, perhaps. But I don't think you can bind that on anyone, especially someone who's not of Jewish descent. And that goes back to who the law was given to, and a lot of other issues that we probably don't have time to get into. But like these are kind of where I'm basing this. Also, we have to deal with the Acts 20 and the 1 Corinthians 16 passages, like when the apostles did come together on the first day of the week and what they were doing. And we agree that Jesus rose on the first day of the week. It was early in the first day of the week while it was still dark, correct?
Yes. And onto that, I would say that that was the Feast of First Fruits. If you have an understanding of the Hebrew calendar and the Hebrew holidays, the year starts out, the first biblical feast that God ordained is Passover, and then you have unleavened bread, and then you have first fruits. They all start within the week. The first fruits is always the first day of the week after the Passover has happened. So, I believe that when he died on Passover. He was, laid to rest on the, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then he resurrected on first fruits. And Paul talks about this when it says that Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. He's making that reference back to the fact that he resurrected on first fruits. But, the way that's kept, it's that first fruits is always on the first day of the week.
Okay. And then Pentecost would have been the first day of the week as well.
Yes. I believe so. I heard an argument recently, and I'd have to go back and study it, that that the Pentecost, which we know that to be in the Hebrew, it's the Feast of Weeks. You count 7 Sabbaths, and then you go the day after the Sabbath. Somebody said that it wasn't the weekly Sabbath that it was referring to, but it was the High Holy Sabbath of the Passover. And so you're supposed to count 49 days. Now that I'm actually talking this out loud, I realize it doesn't make any sense, because you can't count the Passover Sabbath and then count 7 Sabbaths, because you have to then still be referring to the weekly Sabbath. So now that I say this out loud, I realize this person was off on what they were saying. So yes, the Feast of Weeks and Pentecost would have been on the first day of the week, which again, I would say, these are things still being fulfilled on God's calendar, his Hebrew calendar that he established for us to follow. Yes, they happen on the first day of the week, but they are a biblical holiday that's being fulfilled. And I believe that when Jesus returns, he's going to fulfill the last 3 feasts, the Day of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And again, this goes into the eschatology things that I believe,
Right.
At the last trumpet call, the dead in Christ arise first, the Day of Trumpets. That's why people were saying that, that the rapture was going to happen, because that day they were talking about was the Feast of Trumpets, and so, and if I could just dip a little into that, and this might be a monkey wrench in this whole thing. The Passover, Jesus died as the Passover lamb. The Passover is not a sin sacrifice. The Passover was to save the firstborn in the house. So people will say, well, he died for us. He shed his blood for our sins. Yes, I agree. But that blood has not been applied to the altar or to the Holy of Holies like it needs to be for us to atone for us. I believe there will be another temple, and he will physically take his blood, and that will be applied for us at that time. I believe he's going to return on trumpets. I believe he will atone for everyone on Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles will start. There's Day of Trumpets is the first day of the 7th month. 10 days later is the Day of Atonement, which right now this year that'll be according to the calendar that I'm keeping. That'll be Thursday this week, and then there's the 5 days later is the Feast of Tabernacles. So I believe that he's going to return on trumpets. He will atone for us on atonement, and then the new covenant will start at the start of the Feast of Tabernacles. So I could go a lot more into that, but that's what I believe is the future things that we are looking forward to upon his return, for him to fulfill the last 3 feasts that he hasn't fulfilled yet.
Okay, so Acts 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, uh, I think that's even the same chapter, like Paul preaching to midnight and all that. So, was the purpose of them coming together to break bread?
Yes, it says they came together to break bread. They were eating a meal together.
Okay, so you're taking that as a meal and not necessarily the possibility of the communion of the Lord's Supper.
Um, I think it's just a meal. I could be wrong on that. I mean, I haven't delved deep into that, but I think they're just getting together and having a meal. Now, and the thing is too, when it says the first day of the week, the Hebrew rendering of a day, the day starts at evening. That's how they would have been doing things. So, like when the sun sets on Saturday, after the sun goes down, that's now the start of the first day of the week. So this very well could have been that they were breaking bread after their Sabbath services, which some people do. Like some fellowships they have a meal together. So this could very well just be that that it's distinguishing that they were having a meal together after these things on the first day of the week, or they could all have been coming together on the next day. Um, but again, I don't see that as changing or taking away from the Sabbath, or saying that they weren't doing the Sabbath.
So, I'll probably just have this the next question before I get back on that. So, 1 Corinthians 16:2, Paul tells them to bring together an offering, and I think it's for to relieve the saints at Jerusalem,
Hmm.
because Paul was gathering this big collection because there's a famine going on, and all these churches were putting money together to help them out, and that's the purpose of that collection. So uh, the ESV translates that the first day of every week. It's Kata Mien Sabatu. So what what's your understanding of like why were they together on the first day of the week, and why are they taking up a collection then?
Well, it doesn't necessarily say that they were together. He just says to take up the collection on the first day of the week. It doesn't necessarily say that they were, together. In my preparations for this, I heard one person say that gathering, that storing up, as it says, doesn't necessarily mean that they were storing it up to collectively as a group, but they were storing it up within their own home. That way there's nothing that needs to be done when he comes. They've already got it stored up just to give to him, basically. Now, on that aspect too, concerning the Sabbath, you wouldn't be exchanging money or using money. Granted, it wouldn't be buying anything necessarily, but there would be a prohibition against using money on the Sabbath, because that money is tied to work. And if you were to spend money on the Sabbath, at that time, it would have meant somebody was working, because you couldn't buy or sell anything without somebody considered working. So they wouldn't be using money. So I think that's just a matter of he's saying store it up. You know, at the start of your week, put the money to the side. So when I come, we can do with that for the. But again, it doesn't specifically say that they are getting together. It's just saying store it up on this day.
Okay.
Think of it like this, okay? Most people nowadays, right? They get paid on Fridays most days, right? And then, of course, now the way we have a 5-day work week. Where back then they had a 6-day work week. But imagine today we had a 6-day work week, and most businesses were open on Sundays. You would go and people, after you get paid on Friday, right? You're gonna start paying your bills after that. So it's kind of I look at it the same thing. Like, hey, you're paying your bills. Go, make sure you're setting aside for this at that time when you're taking care of all this, the other stuff that you're, if you're going out and buying your bread for the week, or buying your salt dried fish or whatever else. Set aside this day before the money, basically before the money's all gone for the week. Set some aside for them, so then when I come, there's nothing, because it's he's letting them know, hey, I want you to take up a collection for them. I want you to remember them, this, every week, set aside for them to help them. So that way, because if they didn't, then now they're scrambling when he shows up to try to get stuff together for him. Whereas in this, they're putting a little aside every single week for them to help them out.
Okay, so what's your understanding of, I don't know what you call it, communion, Lord's Supper? Is there a specific day it should be taken on? Is it
When
weekly,
when
monthly?
when Jesus said to do it, he said, "As often as you do this in remembrance of me." So there's no command from Jesus to do it on a specific day. In my opinion, in the reading of the scriptures.
Okay. Uh, just give you my view. When it comes to passages like 1 Corinthians 16 and Acts 20, uh, we do see collection and the purpose of breaking of bread. Uh, I can't prove to you that's communion. Um, some translate or some manuscripts do have like the definite article where it's breaking of the bread, and some argue that that means that some people understood it to be the Lord's Supper, but um, that's where the command, example, and necessary inference kind of comes in. And if the language is similar, and it's the first day of every week when they came together to break bread, and it's again, there's a lot of things I'd have to establish to try to convince
Right.
you of that.
Do
But
you
that's
question that?
go
Do
ahead.
you guys use unleavened bread for it? Is that like your tradition?
It is unleavened, yes.
Do you
And
do you know that? Sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. I see what your
I
question
say
probably is.
uh, that when Jesus actually had that meal with the disciples, it was not unleavened bread that they were eating.
I'm not 100% sure about that. I've heard stuff like that. I've heard the Greek
There's
Orthodox
two.
tradition, they use leavened bread.
Well, no, in the Greek language itself, it has a word specifically for leavened bread and a different word for unleavened bread. And man, I had to look it up now. I think one of them is hamotz, and I want to say the other one is aretz, but I could be getting that completely wrong and thinking of totally different words. But if you look at it in the Greek, there's definitely two different words for leavened bread versus unleavened bread. And when we have the institution of what's called the Lord's Supper, when he's having that meal, the bread that it says that they broke was leavened bread, not unleavened bread. Unleavened bread comes in after Passover. They were having a meal before. And that's the other thing. People think that the Lord's Supper is the Passover meal. It wasn't the Passover meal. It couldn't be because he was on the cross during the time of Passover. This was a meal before the Passover, which means they could have still been eating leavened bread. And knowing from, doing, Passover for 10 years now, I know before the Passover, you're commanded, up to the point of unleavened bread to get the leaven out of your house. So if you've got any, you got a loaf of bread or you've got sourdough or you got other stuff that's bread that's been risen, you're eating that stuff to get rid of it, to get out of the house, to clean the house. So which then links to the fact that, yes, it would have been leavened bread that they were eating at that meal before the Passover, not after when they start eating unleavened bread for a week. Do you want me to go look the words up?
No, I'd be interested in looking into that.
Okay.
Just message me. I kind of want to wrap this up in the next 15 minutes.
Okay.
My battery is getting low, and we've been at it for a long time. I'm not necessarily into the discussion. I find it fascinating. Um, so I appreciate what you're saying, and I've listened to a lot of your talking points. I understand how people look at the Old Testament. They see these things. They think we should follow them. And I'm coming from it from a distinction between the old and new. Um, I appreciate what you're bringing. I've listened and I've heard some of these arguments, in part before, like the about Olam and these sort of things. I can't say I'm convinced at this point, but that's really, I just wanted to have the conversation, try to get where you're coming from, and
If I had to use two New Testament or three New Testament passages to prove what I do, it would be John 14:15, 1 Corinthians 11:1, and then 1 John 2:1 through 6. John 14:15, Jesus says, "If you love me, obey my commandments." He doesn't say only these commandments I repeat or that. It's my commandments. And if you believe Jesus is God, you then would have to assert that all of the law of God that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai came from Jesus, and that is his commandments. 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. We know Christ followed the law of Moses, so if we're going to imitate Christ, we have to follow that. And then 1 John 2 says, because we have a sacrifice in him, that he died for us for our sins, we should walk as he walked and live as he lived. And if we claim to be in him, but we don't do these things, the truth is not in us, which I find interesting that he says the truth is not in us, because Psalms 119, 142 says your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and your law is the truth. So I think that's a veiled reference to, again, pointing back to the law of Moses. So for me, everything in the Old Testament aside, from those three passages right there, I can say this is why I do these things, because my Messiah did them, his apostles did them, and we are told to be like him. And I do it not for my salvation, not to add anything to my righteousness. I do it because I love him and I want to be like him and I want to please him. Plain and simple. And to that, I think everybody else should too, and it would be a blessing for them to do that. And like me, I know people were taught lies, and I really appreciate you. I've dealt with a lot of people from the Churches of Christ, and I have to say you are one of the humblest men I've dealt with. There's others out there that I'm not even going to name names, but they are so hate filled that it's like I can't stand them. They're doing a disservice. I mean, you and I don't agree on a lot of things, but your approach is phenomenal. How you do things, so I give you great credit for that. And I know I can be a lot hot-headed at times, and especially in some of my videos. I've kept it, I think pretty cool today. And this is my heart, that people would see the truth and understand the truth, because I was taught those lies too at one point in time. And when I realized the truth, it brought me to my knees that, hey, I was taught a lie, and I need to get things right with my Father.
And yeah, and where I sit on my position, I wouldn't condemn someone for wanting to follow the law, even if you don't have, like I said, even if you're majority Gentile descendant. Most people don't do that. If that's your personal choice, I don't have a problem with that. Once we start saying, well, you should do this when it comes to the Old Testament law, and again, I know your distinction is not for salvation, and I understand that. I'm just saying, for me to say other people should do this and practice this, I think there needs to be a little bit more than just, Jesus was Jewish and he did this, the apostles were Jewish and they did this, but I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just saying,
but it's not about
their doing it. It's just about binding it on other people and telling them they must follow this. That's where I kind of draw the line.
But here's the thing: it's not about
Go ahead.
It's not about them being Jewish, though. It's about who your identity is in Christ. You are Israel. The new covenant is stated to be with Israel. Jeremiah 31, Hebrews chapter 8, Romans chapter is it 7 or 11? Romans chapter 11. Paul talks about the cultivated olive tree and the wild olive tree, and how branches are cut off from the cultivated olive tree to have wild ones. He's talking about being grafted in to Israel, and he plainly states it in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, "You were once strangers from the commonwealth of Israel, but you've been brought in by the blood of Christ." He plainly shows us that we are grafted into Israel. So if we are grafted into Israel, that means the law that was given to Israel is for us today. And I know you make a distinction between the law of God and the law of Christ. And I understand where you're coming from on that, but to me, they are the same. The Torah, the law of God, is the law of Christ, because Christ is God. And I don't think something has to be repeated in the New Testament for us to have to follow it today, because I could point to things like having relations with animals is never repeated again in the New Testament. But yet we would all agree that that's something that we shouldn't be doing. So just because it's not repeated doesn't mean, and it's the thing too. One could say, well, they were doing the Sabbath, so he didn't need to repeat that. Specifically about this one thing, he didn't need to repeat that. He got on them about the other things that they were, not doing so good at. But even then, even the Pharisees still, were not doing the Sabbath in the way it needed to be done. They'd added, so much to it. But yeah, I'll shut up and let you talk again. I'm sorry, I can be long-winded.
Oh, it's fine.
Hang on just a second.
Love Christ.
Hang on a second. I'm getting ready to end the live here. Give me like 5 minutes.
Well, I just want to know if that's all right.
What's that? What's what?
The bowl right there.
Oh. What is it? Oh yeah, that's fine. Sorry.
I just want to specify or clarify. It's the law of Moses, and again, I would still contend it was given primarily and mainly to Israel, if not exclusively. Now there are Gentiles that would come in and proselytes, and that's a bigger discussion. But there's that Old Testament law, that Old Covenant law, and then the New Testament, which is called the law of Christ or the law of the Spirit. Now, I understand how you would see those as interchangeable. Like it's not that I don't understand what you're saying. I just think there are some distinctions that are made, and but I don't have time to continue talking about this just today. And I know you have your own life and your own situation to get to, but I do appreciate the conversation. I just wanted to try to, as far as trying to find inconsistencies with your position, it was difficult. I just think there are some disagreements we have about understanding certain passages from Scripture. And if we ever continue this conversation, if we focus on those, I think we can have more headway. But as far as introduction, I think it's a good conversation to have.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I would be open to it. Now it's gonna be, like Sundays is probably the best day for me. It used to be I work Sundays and I'd hit the road, but I changed positions recently, and so now I get to be home every night. I only work Monday through Friday. But the next couple Sundays is going to be busy for me preparing for the Feast of Tabernacles. Then we'll actually be gone for Feast of Tabernacles. But yeah, middle October, later October, I'd love to have more discussions with you, and we can dig into who is Israel, who is the law given to, we're Gentiles grafted in, all of those things. I would love to dig into that. That would be awesome.
Absolutely, yeah, appreciate it. Well, thanks for the conversation. Thanks for I was just doing a live, and you said, well, why don't we have this conversation, basically, and
Yeah.
I appreciate it. And I hope it's been helpful to kind of understand, if no one's ever heard like what you're teaching before, then I think there's a good introduction, regardless of where your first reaction, where we stand on it, and where we do disagree on some minor points, which kind of become major implications. I'm trying to not trying to soften things too much, but yeah, I just appreciate it. And I wanted to try to not assume that you were teaching like these people I've talked to before or that person. It's good to just get down to what you believe, what I believe, and have that introductory conversation so we can not paint each other a different way.
Yeah, maybe next time you can ask me if I stone people on the Sabbath. That would be fun.
Someone that said in the comments, I didn't want to bring it up, but
so that's an easy one for me to answer. If I can just throw this out there,
sure.
It's in order to in Israel, in order to stone somebody, there were certain requirements. First of all, one, the Torah, the law of God was the rule of law in that land. That was the governing law of those people. So that's first. Second of all, there had to be Levitical priests in place. Third, there had to be judges or elders at the city gates. And if somebody was to be stoned, they had to bring witnesses, like the example we have in the New Testament of the woman caught in adultery, right? They had to be witnesses. There was no in her instance there was no witnesses. But in order for somebody to be stoned, there had to be witnesses. They had to be brought before the Levites. The Levites then, or either the Levites or to the elders at the gates. One of those two, depending on the situation, if it was in Jerusalem or somewhere else. And then the elders are the ones or the Levites made the decision if that person was to be stoned or not. Can anybody stone anybody today? No, because why? Torah is not the rule of law for any country anywhere on earth. And to that point, God never said go and stone people outside of Israel if they don't keep the Sabbath. No, if you are inside of Israel, if you are part of Israel, whether you're in that land or you're grafted in, because it's when you enter a country, you're supposed to abide by the rules of that country, right? That physical land. So if they're not keeping the Sabbath, yeah, but you can't do that today because Torah is not the rule of law. We don't have Levites or elders at the gates or any of that. We don't have the right to be able to do that. And to that point, my desire would not be to kill somebody for not keeping the Sabbath. My desire is to show them that God wants them to keep the Sabbath, that it is a gift that he gave to them. And so I'd want to reason with them that, hey, it's okay to not work for a day. God actually wants you to take a rest and take a break. The world wants you to work 7 days a week. God wants you to only work 6 and rest. So maybe take a break, And so it would be my desire for people to keep the Sabbath, not to stone them for not keeping the Sabbath. But that's one of those things that people will throw out there just because I think it's been ingrained in their brain that that's how it works, and they're not. And to that would be to your point about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law would be, I don't want to stone that person. I want that person to keep the Sabbath because that's what the Father wants them to do. And we can get into that too, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law next time because that's a good discussion as well.
Right. All right, I appreciate it. I'm gonna hop off here.
Yeah.
So appreciate your time. Appreciate
Thank
the
you, Jim.
conversation.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for watching. Just have a good day. God bless. I'm gonna shut off things on my end.